Hey, friend. It has been a long day, hasn't it? This is Nick, the real Nick from Chilling Lullabies, and I see you. You have been carrying so much on your shoulders, and tonight you deserve to put it all down. Just for now, just for tonight, let yourself rest. We will spend these hours together with scary stories that ease your mind and help you let go. A couple of ads in the first 10 minutes, then nothing but peaceful storytelling for the rest of the night. If these stories become your bedtime ritual, hit subscribe and tap the like button. Drop a comment letting me know where in the world you are trying to find sleep tonight. Let us begin right now. Daniel's father was dead at 62, and the obituary didn't mention how, which was how Daniel knew the scratching had claimed him too, the way it was claiming Daniel now, his hands working against the steering wheel even as he drove, fingers bent permanent into claws that remembered the rhythm they'd learned in that crawl space in Connecticut, back when he'd still believed he was working for Ellen's money instead of for something older than houses, older than the words for betrayal or revenge, or the sound your hands make when they've learned to scratch and can't remember how to stop. He heard it first on his second night in Connecticut, back before he understood what hearing it meant. He'd been lying in the back seat of his car with the windows cracked an inch for air, parked in the woods 50 yards from the farmhouse where his father and Ellen had just moved in 3 days earlier, and the sound came from somewhere beneath the dark shape of the house, a rhythmic scraping, metal on wood, purposeful and patient. Daniel sat up and listened, and the sound continued for maybe 2 minutes, and then stopped, and the November woods went silent again, except for wind and bare branches. He'd told himself it was nothing. Old houses made sounds. That's what people said about old houses, that they settled and creaked and produced noises that meant nothing. But the rhythm had been too regular, too deliberate, like someone working with a tool in the dark. And Daniel had sat awake for another hour, listening for it to return before he finally lay back down and pretended to sleep. The job his stepmother had hired him for was simple on paper. Spend 2 weeks weakening the foundation of the house she and Daniel's father had bought, drill into support beams and mortar joints in specific locations she'd marked on a diagram, create structural damage that would look like natural deterioration when engineers examined it later. She'd been very precise about this during their phone conversations, about how the damage needed to accumulate slowly and invisibly, about how it had to pass inspection as ordinary failure of 180-year-old stone rather than deliberate sabotage. She was paying him $10,000, half up front and half on completion, and Daniel had taken the job not because he needed the money, though he did need it badly, but because the opportunity to hurt his father without his father knowing appealed to something dark in him that had been growing for 7 years, since the divorce and the remarriage and the slow erasure of Daniel from his father's life. Ellen had contacted him 6 months ago through his cousin Megan, who'd maintained the family connection Daniel had severed. The message had been simple. She had a job for him. It paid well. It required discretion. Was he interested? Daniel had been interested. He'd driven cross-country from California in his failing sedan, had arrived in Ashford 3 days ago, and had spent those days surveying the property and planning his approach, and sleeping in his car in the woods where his father wouldn't see him. The house itself was larger than Daniel had expected. A sprawling farmhouse built from local stone and timber, sitting on a foundation that showed its age in places. Mortar gaps, settling cracks, the slight tilt you learn to recognize when you'd worked construction long enough. Daniel had worked construction for 6 years after dropping out of college, mostly framing and rough carpentry, enough to understand load distribution and structural integrity, enough to know where to apply pressure to make something fail. Ellen's diagram was thorough and accurate. She'd marked 6 load-bearing beams in the crawl space beneath the dining room. had indicated the mortar joints that needed compromising, had even specified the tools to use and the depth of cuts that would create progressive failure without immediate collapse. She'd clearly researched this carefully, consulted with someone who understood foundations, and Daniel respected the precision even as he questioned what kind of person planned the destruction of their own home with this much care. He assumed insurance fraud. Ellen had been careful not to explain her motives during their conversations, but Daniel could infer the shape of it. Something had gone wrong financially. The house was worth more insured than sold, and Ellen needed a payout that would only come if the structure failed catastrophically and looked like an act of God rather than human intervention. It was fraud, obvious fraud, and Daniel was being paid to be complicit in it, and he'd accepted because complicity felt like justice when the person being defrauded was technically his father, even if his father would never know Daniel's role in it. Resentment was a strange fuel. It burned cold rather than hot, produced a steady energy rather than explosive force, and Daniel had been burning on it for years now, ever since his father had chosen Ellen over trying to repair what was left of his relationship with his son. The choice hadn't been explicit. His father had never said, "I'm picking my new wife over you." But actions spoke clearly enough. The phone calls that stopped being returned, the visits that became awkward and brief, the holidays spent apart with increasingly thin excuses. The wedding Daniel hadn't been invited to until 2 weeks before, when someone finally remembered he existed and sent a courtesy invitation that arrived too late for him to arrange travel even if he'd wanted to attend, which he hadn't. So when Ellen had offered him money to undermine his father's new life, Daniel had said yes, not because he hated his father. He didn't quite. But because he hated the version of his father that Ellen had created, or revealed, or enabled. The man who could forget his son so completely while building this careful retirement dream in rural Connecticut. If the dream collapsed, if the house fell and the insurance paid, and his father had to start over somewhere smaller and more desperate, then maybe Daniel would feel some satisfaction, some sense that cosmic balance had been restored. Or maybe he'd just feel empty. He wasn't sure which outcome he expected. The scratching came back on his third night, louder this time, sustained for longer. Daniel was sitting in his car eating cold food from a gas station when he heard it start. That same rhythmic scraping, and this time he got out and moved quietly through the woods toward the house. The sound was definitely coming from underneath, from the crawl space or foundation, and it continued without variation for nearly 10 minutes before stopping abruptly. Daniel stood in the dark 30 feet from the house and stared at the stone foundation and wondered who else was down there. Ellen had said nothing about anyone else working on the property. She'd implied Daniel would be alone, that the job was his and his alone. But someone was already there, already working on something, and the timing was too coincidental. Ellen hires Daniel to damage the foundation, and someone else is already damaging it? That didn't make sense unless Ellen had hired multiple people for the same job, which seemed both paranoid and financially wasteful, or unless someone else had the same idea she did, which seemed impossible. Daniel waited until dawn and then approached the house carefully, checking sight lines from windows, and found the access point to the crawl space on the north side, a half-buried stone door that led down to a root cellar and then into the space beneath the house. The door was unlocked. Daniel descended the stone stairs and crouched at the entrance to the crawl space and shined his flashlight into the dark. The space was maybe 4 feet high, dirt floor, stone foundation walls, wooden floor joists overhead. It smelled like earth and cold stone and something else, something alive that Daniel couldn't identify. He swept his flashlight across the supports and found fresh gouges immediately, deep scratches in one of the main beams, wood chips scattered beneath it. exactly the kind of damage Ellen had hired him to create, except he hadn't created it yet. Someone else had been down here with tools, working on the same supports Ellen had marked on her diagram. Daniel backed out of the crawl space and climbed the stairs and stood in the November morning, feeling his plan collapse around him. He couldn't do the job if someone else was already doing it. The risk was too high. If he was caught down there with tools while someone else was also sabotaging the foundation, Ellen's careful fraud would become obvious conspiracy, and Daniel would be the one holding evidence when police arrived. He needed to know who else was working, needed to understand what was happening before he could proceed. He called Ellen from a rest stop 20 miles away, using the burner phone she'd given him for emergencies. She answered on the third ring, and Daniel asked her directly, who else had she hired? Ellen said no one, but Daniel was the only one. And Daniel said someone was already working on the foundation. He'd seen fresh damage to the exact support she'd marked. Ellen was silent for several seconds and then asked what he meant by fresh damage. And Daniel described the gouges and the wood chips, and Ellen said that wasn't possible. She'd been in the crawl space 3 days ago, and there was no damage then. Daniel said, well, there was damage now. Someone had been down there with tools in the last 2 days, and he wasn't going to walk into whatever situation this was without understanding it first. Ellen said he was being paranoid, that old houses had all kinds of existing damage, and Daniel said this wasn't old damage, this was fresh. And did she want him to take photos and send them? Ellen said no photos, and told him to wait, that she'd figure out what was happening. Daniel ended the call and drove back to the property and spent the day watching the house from the woods. His father came and went, making supply runs, carrying lumber upstairs, normal renovation activity. Ellen stayed inside mostly, moving from window to window occasionally, her silhouette visible through the wavy glass. Neither of them went near the crawlspace axis. Neither of them showed any indication they knew someone had been working underneath them. And at 2 p.m, while Daniel watched, the scratching started again, loud enough that he could hear it from 50 feet away, rhythmic and purposeful, exactly like the previous nights, except happening in full daylight. Daniel approached the house and pressed his ear against the foundation and felt the vibration through stone, felt the regularity of it, and understood with cold certainty that whoever was down there was working right now in the middle of the day while his father and Ellen were inside. He circled to the north side and found the root cellar door standing open, which he'd closed that morning. Someone had gone down while he was away. He descended carefully and crouched at the crawlspace entrance and aimed his flashlight into the dark and saw nothing. No person, no movement. But the scratching was louder now, close, maybe 10 feet away, and it continued without acknowledging his presence. Daniel called out, asked if anyone was there, and his voice echoed flat against stone, and the scratching stopped immediately. Silence held for maybe 30 seconds. Then the scratching resumed, closer now, and Daniel saw the beam he'd examined that morning shaking slightly, vibrating with each impact of whatever tool was being used, and he realized he could see the beam clearly because light was coming from somewhere else in the crawl space, a faint glow deeper in, and someone was working by that light. Daniel crawled forward into the space, his flashlight cutting through dark, and called out again that he could see them. They should come out, and the scratching stopped again. The glow remained. Daniel moved toward it, and the crawl space seemed longer than it should be. The foundation extending farther than he remembered from his morning survey, and when he finally reached the source of the light, he found it wasn't a light at all, but a gap in the foundation where afternoon sun came through, illuminating a section of floor he hadn't noticed before. And there on the ground, arranged carefully, a sleeping bag, a camp stove, plastic containers with supplies, and a spiral notebook lying open. Daniel picked up the notebook and read the first entry in handwriting that wasn't his. November 4th. They arrived at dusk. He carries tools upstairs. She watches from windows. Bedroom light off by 11. Daniel checked the date on his phone. November 4th was 3 days ago, the day his father and Ellen had moved in. He flipped through more pages and found entries describing routines in precise detail. But some of the details were wrong in a way that made Daniel's skin crawl. An entry dated November 5th mentioned his father making a supply run on Tuesday. Today was Wednesday. His father had made a supply run yesterday, exactly as the notebook predicted, though Daniel had been watching and his father had seemed to choose the timing spontaneously. An entry dated November 6th described the bedroom light going off at 11, and Daniel had watched from the woods last night and seen the light go dark at 10:58, close enough. But an entry dated November 9th, 2 days in the future, described his father installing motion lights on the north side of the house. An entry dated November 12th mentioned Ellen pacing between kitchen and dining room for an hour each evening. An entry dated November 15th noted that his father would stop renovation work entirely and spend his time checking windows and locks. The notebook wasn't recording what had happened. It was predicting what would happen, describing routines that hadn't been established yet, events that were still days away, as though whoever wrote it was watching from a point in time that hadn't arrived. The final entry was dated today and read November 7th, third support beam compromised. Foundation settling faster than expected. 4 more days of work. Someone had been living down here, watching his father and Ellen, damaging the foundation systematically, and keeping a log that seemed to know the future. Daniel tried to understand who would do this and how they could predict days that hadn't happened yet, but the notebook offered no explanation. Just observations written in neat handwriting that grew more cramped and urgent as the dates progressed. He heard footsteps overhead, his father's weight on floorboards, and realized he'd been down here longer than he'd intended. He photographed several pages of the notebook with his phone and left the supplies where they were and backed out of the crawl space and climbed the stone stairs and stood blinking in afternoon sun, trying to process what he'd found. His phone buzzed. Ellen texting from the burner. "Stop calling me. Do the job or leave." Daniel deleted the message and walked back to his car and sat there thinking about the notebook and the sleeping bag and the scratching that happened, whether anyone was in the crawl space or not. He thought about Ellen and her careful diagram and her precise instructions, and wondered whether she knew about the other person, whether she'd hired them first and they'd gone rogue, or whether something else was happening that Ellen didn't understand either. He decided to show her. Not tell her over the phone where she could dismiss it, but bring her down to the crawl space and show her the supplies in the notebook with its impossible predictions. He waited until dark and then walked to the house and knocked on the front door. And when Ellen answered, she looked at him like he was a ghost or a threat. And before he could speak, she said his name in a whisper and told him to leave, to go now. His father couldn't see him. Daniel said he needed to show her something, and Ellen said, "Not here, not now," and Daniel said yes here, and yes now, because someone else was living in the crawl space, and Ellen needed to see it. Ellen's face changed then, became something harder, and she asked what he was talking about. Daniel described the notebook and the sleeping bag and the entries that described things before they happened, and Ellen went very still. She asked whether he'd taken anything from the crawl space, and Daniel said no, he'd left it all there. He wanted her to see it herself. Ellen looked back into the house where Daniel's father was moving around upstairs, and then told Daniel to wait. She closed the door, and 5 minutes later came out wearing a coat, and told him to show her. They descended the stairs together, and Ellen crawled into the space with a flashlight, and Daniel followed. And when they reached the spot where the supplies had been, there was nothing. No sleeping bag, no camp stove, no containers, no notebook. Just disturbed dirt where something had been recently. Ellen aimed her flashlight at the empty ground and said she didn't see anything. Daniel stared at the space and said there had been supplies here 2 hours ago. He'd held the notebook, read the entries. Ellen asked what the entries said, and Daniel described them. Routines, bedroom light patterns, supply runs scheduled before they'd happened. And Ellen's face changed, became something Daniel couldn't read. She asked how someone could have written about things before they happened, and Daniel said he didn't know. That's why he wanted her to see it. But now it was gone. Ellen was silent for a moment, and then said maybe he'd been confused. Maybe he'd found old supplies from previous squatters and misread the dates. Daniel said no, the dates were this week. They described Ellen and his father specifically. And Ellen said Daniel had never been to this house before 3 days ago. How would he know what their routines looked like to verify against notebook entries? The scratching started then while they were both in the crawl space, loud enough that Ellen flinched and grabbed Daniel's arm. It was coming from deeper in the foundation, from a section they hadn't crawled to yet, and it continued in that same patient rhythm for maybe a minute before stopping. Ellen's grip on Daniel's arm tightened, and she said they needed to leave, needed to get out now. Daniel said someone was down here with them, and Ellen said she didn't care, they were leaving. They crawled back to the entrance faster than they'd entered, and climbed the stairs and stood in the November cold, catching their breath. Ellen's face was pale, and she kept looking back at the open door leading down. She said she didn't know what Daniel had seen, but there was nothing there now, and whatever the scratching was, they needed to stay away from it. Daniel said he had photos on his phone, and Ellen said she didn't want to see photos. She wanted Daniel to finish the job tonight and leave Connecticut immediately. Daniel said someone else was already doing the work, and Ellen said she didn't care about someone else. She cared about Daniel doing what she'd paid him for. She said if he didn't finish it tonight, she'd tell his father everything. That Daniel was here, that she'd hired him, that he'd been paid to destroy their house. Daniel said if she did that, she'd expose her own fraud. And Ellen said she'd claimed Daniel had approached her, had tried to extort her, that she'd refused, and he'd done it anyway out of spite. Daniel said no one would believe that, and Ellen said his father would believe it, because his father wanted to believe Ellen over Daniel. Had been wanting that for 7 years, and this would just confirm what his father already suspected, that Daniel was unstable, resentful, destructive. Daniel felt something cold settle in his chest. She was right. His father would believe her. That was the leverage she'd always had. And now Daniel was trapped between completing a fraud he didn't fully understand and walking away marked as an extortionist. He said he'd do it tonight. Ellen repeated her instructions about which beams to work on, which mortar joints to compromise. She said to work until dawn to make sure the damage was sufficient, and then to leave and wait for her to contact him about the final payment. Daniel said he wanted the full payment now, and Ellen said that wasn't the arrangement, and Daniel said the arrangement had changed when someone else started working on the foundation before him. Ellen looked at him for a long moment and then said fine. She'd pay him the full amount tomorrow, but only if the work was done properly tonight. Daniel agreed, and Ellen went back inside, and Daniel stood alone in the dark, thinking about the notebook that had vanished, and the scratching in empty spaces, and the feeling that he'd walked into something that had been waiting for him. He went to his car and got the tools Ellen had specified: a cordless drill, wood chisels, a battery-powered reciprocating saw. He waited until midnight when the lights in the house went dark, and then descended into the crawl space and crawled to the first support beam on Ellen's diagram. He began drilling into the support where it met the foundation, creating holes that would weaken the connection. The drill was loud in the enclosed space, and Daniel worked quickly, moving from one hole to the next in a pattern that would distribute the damage naturally. He'd done similar work before, demolition and selective removal, and his hands knew the movements without conscious attention. Halfway through the first beam, the scratching started somewhere to his left, deeper in the foundation. Daniel stopped drilling and listened. The sound was close, maybe 15 feet away, and it had the same rhythm as before, but louder now, more insistent. Daniel called out again, asked who was there, and the scratching stopped for maybe 10 seconds before resuming. He crawled toward it, leaving his drill behind, and the scratching moved away from him, maintaining distance. Daniel followed it through the crawl space, and the foundation seemed to extend farther than he remembered from his memory of the house's footprint. He thought about turning back, but the scratching was leading him somewhere specific. He could feel it, could sense intention in the way it moved and stopped, and started again when he paused. He reached a section of foundation he didn't remember seeing before. Older stone, different mortar, construction that looked like it predated the rest of the house. The scratching was coming from behind this wall, rhythmic and purposeful. And when Daniel pressed his ear against the stone, he felt vibration that seemed to come from much deeper than the crawl space should extend, as though something was working in a space beneath the foundation itself. He returned to his drill and his tools and tried to focus on the work Ellen had hired him for, but the scratching continued throughout the night, sometimes close and sometimes distant, always keeping that same steady rhythm. Daniel worked through all 6 support beams on Ellen's diagram, drilling and chiseling and weakening the connections between wood and stone, and by the time dawn light started filtering through gaps in the foundation, he'd completed the job. The supports were compromised. The foundation would fail within days, maybe a week. And when engineers examined the damage, they'd see settling and age and natural deterioration, not deliberate sabotage. Daniel crawled out of the space and climbed the stone stairs and stood in early morning cold, his hands aching and his clothes covered in stone dust. He'd done what Ellen asked. The house would collapse. His father would lose his retirement dream, and Daniel would have his revenge, hollow as it felt now that it was accomplished. He walked to his car and got in and drove to a rest stop and called Ellen from the parking lot. She answered immediately, and Daniel said it was done. All 6 supports were compromised. She could expect failure within the week. Ellen asked whether anyone had seen him, and Daniel said no, he'd worked at night, but the scratching had continued the entire time. Someone else had been down there. Ellen said she didn't want to hear about scratching. She just wanted confirmation the job was complete. And Daniel said it was complete, but she needed to understand something else was happening, something neither of them had planned for. Ellen said she'd transfer the final payment by end of day and told Daniel to leave Connecticut immediately, to drive back to California and forget this job ever happened. Daniel said he wanted the money now, right now, and Ellen said it didn't work that way. She needed to verify the damage first. Daniel said he'd just told her the damage was done, and Ellen said she needed to see it herself before releasing payment. Daniel felt anger building in his throat. She was going to stall him, was going to find some excuse not to pay. He said he'd wait 24 hours for the payment, and if it didn't arrive, he'd call his father and tell him everything. Ellen said that would be a mistake, and Daniel said at this point he had nothing to lose. He ended the call and drove back to the property and parked in his usual spot in the woods and sat there wondering what he'd actually accomplished. His father's house would fall. That was certain now. The supports Daniel had weakened would fail under weight they'd carried for 180 years, and the floor would collapse, and his father would call engineers and insurance adjusters, and Daniel would have $5,000 in the knowledge that he'd hurt his father without his father ever knowing who'd hurt him, which was supposed to feel like justice, but felt more like he'd poisoned something in himself that could never be unpoisoned. He slept in his car for a few hours and woke to his phone buzzing. Ellen texting, "Police are here. Someone called them. Don't come near the house." Daniel sat up and looked through the trees and saw 2 police cars in the driveway. He watched from a distance, and 20 minutes later, the officers emerged from the crawl space carrying evidence bags, and his father came out of the house looking pale and confused. Daniel's phone buzzed again. Ellen. They found supplies in crawl space. Sleeping bag, notebook. Told them about vandalism, but don't contact me again. Daniel stared at the message. The supplies that had vanished when he showed Ellen were back now and had been discovered by police. But Ellen's text didn't sound triumphant or calculated. It sounded confused, almost frightened. He enlarged the photos he'd taken of the notebook pages and studied the handwriting and the impossible dates and wondered whether Ellen had written them or whether something else had, whether the supplies appearing and disappearing and reappearing followed any human logic at all. Over the next 3 days, Daniel stayed in the woods watching the house, watching police come and go, watching engineers arrive to examine the foundation. His father became increasingly paranoid, checking windows, installing lights, walking the property with a flashlight after dark. Ellen stayed inside mostly, and Daniel could see her silhouette passing windows with a frequency that suggested pacing, fear, someone who'd lost control of a situation she thought she'd controlled. On the 4th day, the foundation failed. Daniel was in his car when he heard the sound. A deep groan, wood and stone settling, and then a louder crack that echoed across the property. His father came running out of the house and stood in the driveway staring at the structure. And 5 minutes later, police cars and fire trucks arrived, and engineers in hard hats emerged and went into the house and came out shaking their heads. Daniel got out of his car and walked closer, staying in the tree line, and heard one engineer talking to his father about catastrophic failure, about how the supports had been weakened systematically over time, about how the damage looked deliberate. His father asked whether it could be repaired, and the engineer said no. The house was structurally unsound. They needed to evacuate immediately. Daniel watched his father's face and saw something break in it, saw the careful retirement dream dissolve in real time, and felt no satisfaction at all. He'd wanted this. He'd caused this. And now that it had happened, he felt nothing except a kind of empty certainty that he'd destroyed something in himself along with the house. His phone buzzed. Text from an unknown number. Police ran your plates. They know the car. Leave now. Daniel looked around and saw no one, saw no police approaching, but the warning felt credible. He got in and started driving, heading west toward New York, and his phone buzzed again 2 hours later. Another text from the same number. APB issued. They're looking for you. Daniel pulled into a rest stop and sat in his car trying to understand how Ellen was tracking him, how she knew what the police were doing. Unless the texts weren't from Ellen, unless someone else was watching the situation unfold, someone who'd been in the crawl space all along. His phone rang. Actual call, not text. Daniel answered and heard breathing on the other end, and then his father's voice, quiet and strained, asking if this was Daniel. Daniel's throat closed. He managed to say yes, it was him. His father said the police had identified a California-registered vehicle seen on the property, had traced it to Daniel's address, had connected him through Ellen, and Ellen had told them everything. That Daniel had contacted her months ago, that he'd tried to extort money, that she'd refused, and he'd vandalized the house in retaliation. His father said the police wanted to talk to Daniel, wanted him to come back to Connecticut to give a statement. And Daniel needed to tell him right now whether any of what Ellen was saying was true. Daniel could lie, could say Ellen was fabricating everything. But his father's voice carried a weight that made lying impossible. A kind of exhausted certainty that he already knew the answer and was just waiting for Daniel to confirm it. Daniel said yes, he'd been there, but not for extortion. Ellen had hired him, had paid him to damage the foundation. Daniel had done the work. The house had failed because of him. And he'd done it because His father interrupted and said he didn't want to hear why. He said Daniel needed to turn himself in, needed to talk to the police, needed to take responsibility for what he'd done. Daniel said if he did, that Ellen would claim he was lying, would produce the extortion story, and no one would believe him. His father said maybe no one would believe him, but that didn't change what was right. Daniel felt something like grief in his chest, sharp and physical. His father was disappointed. Not surprised. Disappointed. As though this outcome had been expected all along, as though Daniel's presence in Connecticut doing damage had simply confirmed what his father had always feared about him. Daniel said he was sorry. His father was quiet for several seconds, and Daniel heard something in the background. A rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming on a table, regular and persistent. His father said sorry wasn't sufficient, that Daniel had destroyed their house, had destroyed Ellen's sense of safety, had destroyed any possibility of reconciliation. Daniel said he'd only done what Ellen had paid him to do, and his father said that was worse, that Daniel had let himself be weaponized against his own family. The tapping continued behind his father's voice, steady and purposeful. Daniel asked what that sound was. His father paused. Said, "What sound?" Daniel said that tapping, that scratching sound. His father was silent for several seconds and then said there was no sound. The call was breaking up, and Daniel needed to do the right thing. But the tapping continued, clearer now, and Daniel realized his father couldn't hear it himself, couldn't hear his own fingers working against the table while he spoke, maintaining that same rhythm Daniel had heard in the crawl space. The call ended. Daniel sat in the rest stop parking lot and stared at his phone and thought about that sound, about his father's fingers moving without his knowledge, and understood that whatever had been in the foundation hadn't just claimed him. It had claimed everyone who'd touched the house. His father, Ellen, maybe even the police who'd gone into the crawl space. The infection spread through contact, through proximity, and Daniel had brought it to his father by drilling into supports while something else scratched alongside him. He kept driving west, made it to Ohio before police pulled him over. Arrest, extradition, 3 days in holding, Megan posting bail with money she didn't have, a lawyer who said the case was bad, Ellen's extortion story, the notebook that predated his arrival, no physical evidence linking Ellen to him except his word. The plea came fast. Criminal mischief, attempted fraud, restitution, and probation in exchange for no prison time. Daniel took it because the alternative was trial and years inside. His father didn't attend the hearing. Ellen sat in the front row looking traumatized. And when the judge asked for her statement, she said Daniel had contacted her months ago with a plan to destroy the house. And when she refused, he'd done it anyway. Daniel signed the papers, was released with conditions, stay away from his father and Ellen, monthly restitution payments he couldn't afford, counseling he didn't want. He moved back to California and found work doing day labor, cash jobs, trying to figure out how to live with what he'd done. But the scratching followed him. It started 3 weeks after he returned to California, living in a weekly motel outside Fresno, working construction cleanup for a contractor who didn't ask questions. Daniel was lying on the narrow bed at 2 a.m. when he heard it start in the wall beside him. That same rhythmic scraping, metal on wood, exactly the same rhythm he'd heard in Connecticut. He sat up and listened, and it continued for several minutes before stopping. And Daniel told himself it was pipes, or the building settling, or the people in the next room doing something inexplicable. But it came back the next night at the same time, and the night after that, and within a week, it was happening every night between 2 and 3, that same purposeful rhythm, and Daniel couldn't pretend anymore that it was coincidence. The sound had followed him from Connecticut. Something in that crawl space had marked him, had claimed him, and now it was making itself known in this motel room a continent away. Daniel changed motels. The scratching continued in the new room. He moved to a different town entirely and found a boarding house in Bakersfield, and the scratching started there on his first night, always between 2 and 3 a.m., always that same rhythm, always seeming to come from inside the walls where nothing should be. He stopped sleeping, would lie awake through the hours when the scratching happened, listening to it, trying to understand what it wanted. Sometimes it sounded far away, muffled by distance. Other times it sounded close, as though whatever was making it was working just inches from where Daniel lay. He pressed his ear against the wall during one episode and felt vibration through plaster, felt the regularity of it, and his hands started to move without his conscious control, started to curl into the same position, fingers bent like claws. Daniel pulled his hands back and looked at them in the dark, and saw his fingernails were torn, ragged at the edges, though he didn't remember damaging them. He got up and turned on the light and examined the wall where he'd been lying and found fresh gouges, finger-width scratches running from the baseboard up to waist height, and beneath his nails was plaster dust. He'd made them. He didn't remember making them, but the evidence was unmistakable. While he'd been lying there listening to the scratching in the walls, his own hands had been scratching the wall, creating the sound he thought he was hearing from somewhere else. Or the sound was both. Something in the walls and something in him, working in parallel, and he couldn't tell anymore where one stopped and the other started. He tried restraining his hands, taped them in oven mitts before lying down. Woke to find he'd removed the mitts in his sleep and gouged new scratches into a different section of wall. He tied his hands to the bed frame with extension cord, woke with rope burns on his wrists and fresh scratches on the ceiling where his hands had reached above him while he slept. The landlady noticed the damage during an inspection, asked what Daniel had done to the walls, and Daniel said he didn't know. He must have been scratching in his sleep. And the landlady said he needed to pay for repairs, leave. Daniel paid what he could, and the landlady said it wasn't enough. The damage was extensive, and it gave him a week to vacate. Daniel moved again, and again. Each new room showed the same damage within days. Walls covered in parallel scratches, gouges that appeared overnight while Daniel slept or tried to sleep, and his hands always showed evidence the next morning. Torn nails and plaster dust and aching fingers bent permanently into a clawed position that he couldn't fully straighten anymore. He stopped working. Couldn't focus on labor when he wasn't sleeping. Couldn't trust his hands to do what he intended when they had their own agenda at night. His money ran out. He started sleeping in his car again, and the scratching followed him there too. He'd wake to find he'd gouged scratches into the car's interior panels, the upholstery, the dashboard, wherever his hands could reach while he slept. He called Megan once, late at night, and tried to explain what was happening. Megan said he needed help, professional help. He was clearly having a breakdown from the stress of the arrest and the plea. Daniel said this wasn't stress. Something had followed him from Connecticut. Something that had been in that crawl space all along. Megan said there was nothing in the crawl space except supplies someone had left, and Daniel needed to stop obsessing over it and focus on rebuilding his life. Daniel said his hands were scratching walls every night. He couldn't stop them, didn't remember doing it, but woke to find new damage every time he slept. Megan said that was parasomnia, sleep disorder, treatable with medication and therapy. Daniel asked whether parasomnia could make you scratch in the exact rhythm you'd heard in a crawl space 3,000 miles away, and Megan said maybe it was PTSD. Maybe the rhythm was lodged in his memory and his unconscious was replaying it. Daniel said it felt like more than memory. It felt like participation, like he was working on something he couldn't see, continuing something that had been started in Connecticut. Megan asked what he meant by continuing, And Daniel said he didn't know. He just knew that every night his hands moved, and every morning there were new marks, and his fingers were getting weaker, the joints stiffening, arthritis setting in early from the repetitive motion. He tried calling his father once, months later, wanting to warn him about the tapping he'd heard, wanting to ask if his father's hands had started moving too. The number was disconnected. Daniel searched online and found an obituary. Peter, dead at 62, cause unlisted. The obituary mentioned he'd been living in Vermont, working as a carpenter until recently. Services private. It didn't mention how he died. Daniel stared at the obituary photo. His father's face, older than he remembered, eyes tired, and thought about the tapping sound on that last phone call, about his father's fingers drumming without his knowledge, and wondered how long his father had scratched before his hands gave out entirely, whether he'd understood what was happening before the end, whether he died still scratching, or whether the scratching had simply used him until there was nothing left to use. That's when Daniel understood he was going to die the same way. The scratching would continue until his hands wore out, until the arthritis and the torn tendons and the repetitive motion damage made it impossible for him to hold anything or feed himself or drive. And then the scratching would claim whatever was left, would work through him until he was empty, until all that remained was the rhythm and the sound and the endless movement that had no purpose except to continue. 6 months after finding the obituary, Daniel drove back to Connecticut. He told himself it was closure, a need to see where it had started. But really he needed to know whether the scratching was still happening there, whether the sound existed in the land itself, or whether he'd brought it with him when he left. The property had been cleared. The house was gone, demolished, the foundation excavated and filled in. A for sale sign stood among weeds. Daniel parked at the edge of the lot and walked to where the dining room had been, where the crawl space beneath it had held the supports he'd damaged. The ground was level and unremarkable. Nothing indicated a house had stood here for 180 years. Daniel crouched and put his hand on the ground and felt only earth, cold and damp. He closed his eyes and listened for scratching, for any indication that the sound was here, embedded in the land itself, but he heard nothing except wind and distant traffic. And then his hands started to move. Without his intending it, without conscious control, his fingers curled and began scraping against the ground, digging into dirt and gravel, creating the rhythm he'd been making every night for months. Daniel tried to stop them, but couldn't. Tried to pull his hands back, but they continued working, gouging furrows in the earth where the foundation had been. And he realized this was what the scratching had always been. Not something haunting him, but something working through him, using his hands to continue whatever task it had been doing in the crawl space. And he'd become part of it when he drilled into those supports, had joined it somehow through the act of deliberately damaging the foundation while it was doing the same thing. He'd thought he was working alongside it. He'd been wrong. He'd been working with it, had become part of its mechanism, and now he couldn't separate himself from it because there was no longer a meaningful distinction between Daniel's hands and the thing that moved them. He stood and walked back to his car, his hands still trying to move, still trying to curl into scratching position, and drove away from Ashford, knowing he couldn't stay still because staying still meant scratching, and scratching meant accepting that he'd become something other than human, something that existed only to continue a task that had no purpose and no end. He drives still, moving between towns, sleeping in his car when he can't stay awake any longer, and always the scratching comes between 2 and 3 a.m., his hands working against whatever surface they can reach, the steering wheel, the dashboard, the window glass. Sometimes people see him parked in rest stops or parking lots, see his hands moving in the dark, and they knock on his window and ask if he's okay, and Daniel says yes, he's fine, he's just tired, and they leave him alone. His fingers are bent permanent now, locked in a clawed position from the arthritis and the repetitive motion, and he can't hold tools anymore, can't work, can barely eat or dress himself. But his hands can still scratch. They're stronger at scratching than they ever were at building, and every night they continued the work that Daniel started in that crawl space in Connecticut. The work that had been happening before he arrived and will continue after he's gone, because he's not the scratching's origin or its destination. Just one more set of hands it found to use for a while. One more person who thought they could benefit from someone else's plan and discovered too late that the plan was older and larger and more patient than any human scheme. That it had been waiting in that foundation for someone desperate enough or angry enough or stupid enough to drill into supports that were holding back something that wanted it to be released. Daniel is that release now. He is the mechanism of whatever the scratching wants, moving through the world, making marks on surfaces no one will see until years later when the damage accumulates, and buildings start to fail the way his father's house failed. His father understood it at the end, Daniel thinks. That tapping on the phone call was his father's hands beginning the same work, and the obituary said he'd been working as a carpenter in Vermont. And Daniel imagines his father in some workshop up there, his hands moving without permission while he tried to build furniture, scratching grooves into wood he was supposed to be finishing, unable to stop, unable to understand what was happening, until his hands wore out entirely and the scratching claimed whatever was left. Ellen is out there too, Daniel suspects. He's never tried to find her, but he knows she's somewhere scratching her own walls. Or maybe she fought it harder than he did, and it claimed her faster. The insurance never paid out. The fraud was too obvious once investigators looked closely at the timeline in the notebook with its impossible predictions. Ellen lost everything the same way Daniel lost everything, and the only question was whether she understood, before it was too late, that neither of them had been planning anything. They'd both been instruments of something that had been planning them, using their desperation and their resentment and their belief that they could control outcomes to move them into position, into the crawl space, into proximity with the supports that needed weakening, into the work of releasing whatever had been held back by stone and mortar for longer than houses or humans or the words we use to name the things that outlast us. His hands scrape against the steering wheel even now, even as he drives, creating rhythms he doesn't control, and Daniel knows he'll never stop driving, will never stop moving from town to town, because stopping means scratching in one place long enough, the people notice, the police come, that he's institutionalized or imprisoned or identified, and he can't let that happen because the scratching needs to spread, needs to find new buildings and new foundations, needs more hands to join the work that will eventually bring everything down if enough people make his mistake, if enough foundations are weakened, if enough support beams are compromised by people who thought they were using the scratching for their own purposes and discovered they were being used instead, that they were always going to be used, that their resentment and their pain and their desperate need for justice or money or revenge was exactly what the scratching needed to recognize them as candidates for recruitment, as hands that would do what needed to be done without understanding what they were doing or why. And Daniel's hands move against the wheel and the work continues, and somewhere in a foundation that hasn't fallen yet, someone else is hearing scratching for the first time and wondering what it is and whether they can use it. And the answer is always the same. The scratching uses you. The scratching claims you. The scratching continues. And Daniel is just one voice in a chorus that's been singing since before houses existed, singing the song of things that want to fall, of stone that wants to return to earth, of structures that were always temporary, pretending to be permanent. And the scratching knows this, has always known this. And Daniel scratches through the night in rest stop, parking lots, waiting for the day when enough hands have joined that every foundation is compromised, when every support beam is weakened, when everything built on stone finally remembers that stone doesn't hold forever, that everything that rises eventually falls, and the scratching is just helping it happen sooner, one scratch at a time, one night at a time, one pair of hands at a time, spreading and continuing and patient and tireless and inevitable as erosion, as gravity, as the certainty that Daniel will never stop scratching, because stopping isn't what hands do once they've learned this work. Once they've been claimed by something older than the word for claiming. Once they become part of the mechanism that moves through the world, marking everything it touches, with the promise that nothing built will stand forever, and the scratching will be there when it falls, waiting beneath the rubble for the next desperate person to arrive and think they can profit from the sound they hear in the foundation, the sound that Daniel hears even now, even in silence, the sound that is his hands and the walls and his father's fingers and Ellen's walls and every surface he's ever touched since Connecticut. The sound that is everything now, the only thing, the scratching that never stops. Because Daniel is the scratching, and the scratching is Daniel, and the work continues. Judith Crane had been looking at the painting for what she later calculated must have been 40 minutes, long enough for the wine in her glass to reach the temperature of the room and the light outside the tall Georgetown windows to finish its passage from amber to the certain shade of urban gray that meant the street lamps on P Street had come on. She did not know what was wrong with the composition. She knew only that something had been, since the morning she had first set the canvas on the easel and stepped back to plan her campaign against 2.5 centuries of grime and amateur varnish. Something in the way the family had been arranged, father and mother and 2 children, that resisted the eye's natural desire to settle. The painting had arrived 3 weeks earlier from the estate of a man named Kessler, the last of a Viennese collecting family whose holdings had been liquidated piecemeal since the 1920s. A probate lawyer in Bethesda had contacted Judith through the conservator's directory, explaining that the estate contained several uncatalogued works that needed cleaning before auction. Most were minor: Dutch still lifes, a mediocre Italian landscape, 2 watercolors of no value. But one canvas, wrapped in acid-free tissue inside a wooden shipping crate that bore custom stamps from 1923, had come with a provenance folder so thin it amounted to confession. Almost nothing was known. An Austrian noble family, name illegible on the acquisition card. Oil on linen, circa 1740, unsigned. Stored in the Kessler family's possession for nearly 40 years because no one could determine who had painted it or why it mattered enough to keep. The lawyer wanted it presentable for a spring auction and was not concerned with method or documentation. Judith had accepted the assignment with the mild professional pleasure of a woman who preferred problems of surface to problems of meaning. Strip the discolored varnish, stabilize the crequelure, reveal whatever the artist had actually put down, and let the auction house argue about the rest. She set down her wine and crossed the room to the easel. The apartment doubled as her workspace, the second bedroom of a converted row house on 34th Street, fitted with northern light, solvent ventilation, and a magnification lamp clamped to a drafting table she'd purchased from a retired architect on Wisconsin Avenue. The painting, roughly 2 feet by 3, depicted a domestic interior of characteristic 18th century formality. A man standing behind a seated woman, his hands resting on her shoulders, two children arranged at the woman's knees. The palette was muted. Browns and ochres darkened further by the degraded varnish. The faces pale ovals above lace collars. Conventional in every respect. She had seen 40 paintings exactly like it. What she could not resolve, standing now close enough to smell the linseed and age, was the father's hands. They lay on the woman's shoulders with a heaviness that the period style did not explain. The convention was possession. The husband's hand on the wife's shoulder signaled authority, lineage, the ordinary architecture of property. But these hands seemed to press. The fingers were not displayed but gripped, the knuckles carrying a tension that suggested effort rather than pose. Judith tilted the magnification lamp and the craquelure threw tiny shadows across the surface, a net of fractures that made the painted skin look like something that might, given enough pressure, break apart entirely. She straightened. It was a Tuesday in October, and she had been working too long and drinking wine on a stomach that had received only a sandwich since noon. The father's hands were painted hands. They pressed because the artist had failed to master the anatomy of relaxation, or because the varnish had darkened selectively, or because she was 40 minutes into a stare that would make any image begin to seem intentional in ways its maker never planned. She covered the canvas with a cotton drape, washed her glass, and went to bed. In the morning, the drape was where she had left it. The painting beneath was exactly as it should have been. The test strip she had begun along the lower left border, a small rectangle of clean surface showing brighter color beneath the varnish, looked correct. The blue-green of a tiled floor emerging from under decades of yellowed resin. Judith mixed her solvent, a careful proportion of acetone and white spirit that she had calibrated to how stubbornly the varnish resisted, and resumed work. By noon, she had cleared a band roughly 4 inches wide along the entire bottom edge. The tiled floor was more vivid than she had expected. A deep blue-green that seemed almost to pulse against the muted tones above, less like color and more like the memory of a lit room sealed behind dirty glass. She worked in even passes, rolling tiny cotton swabs across the surface in even strokes. Watching the yellow-brown residue transfer to white cotton, the children's shoes emerged. They were oddly positioned. Both pairs turned slightly inward as if the children were pressing their feet together, toes touching with a deliberateness that the artist had rendered in exact, almost clinical detail. The stitching on the left child's shoe, the crease in the right child's leather, all captured with a precision that exceeded the rest of the composition by a margin she found difficult to explain. Period convention called for generalized footwear. These shoes had been painted by someone who was looking at something specific and was afraid of getting it wrong. She noted the discrepancy in her log and continued. That evening, she stood before the uncovered canvas and felt the first cold movement of something she would not, at that point, have called unease. The father's right hand had changed, not the hand itself. The craquelure was identical, the paint surface undisturbed, but its position on the woman's shoulder had shifted perhaps 1/4 of an inch toward the neck. The thumb, which she distinctly remembered lying flat against the collarbone, now hooked slightly inward as though the hand were beginning to close. Judith removed the magnification lamp from the drafting table and held it directly over the shoulder area. The paint was original. No retouching, no fresh material, nothing that would indicate physical alteration. She photographed the area with her Polaroid. She kept one in the studio for documentation and pinned the image to the corkboard above the table. She told herself she would compare it to her cleaning notes in the morning. She told herself this very firmly, as one does when the alternative is to admit that one's professional instruments have confirmed something that one's professional training cannot explain. She did not cover the canvas that night. She left the studio light on and the door open, and slept with her own bedroom door open too, as though the painting were a child she wished to hear if it cried out. Nothing happened. She woke to the sound of the furnace clicking on and the gray October light that Georgetown wore like a permanent expression of mild disapproval. The painting was still on the easel. The father's hand was where it had been the night before. She took the Polaroid from the corkboard and held it beside the canvas under the magnification lamp, then laid her conservation ruler across both, the flat edge bridging the photograph and the painted surface, the millimeter graduations fine enough to settle the question. The thumb had moved, 3 millimeters toward the throat. The ruler confirmed it. The photograph confirmed it. The evidence was measurable, repeatable, and entirely incompatible with the physical properties of dried oil paint on a linen substrate, which meant that either her camera had introduced parallax distortion at midnight that happened to simulate exactly the kind of positional shift she had perceived, or the canvas had warped microscopically in the October humidity in a pattern that happened to mimic anatomical movement, or the paint had moved. She chose the humidity. She chose it the way a person chooses the less frightening diagnosis when the doctor offers 2. Not because the evidence supports it, but because the alternative requires reorganizing everything you know about how the world operates, and she was not ready on a Thursday morning to do that. She cleaned another 6 inches. The woman's hands came clear, folded in her lap, pale, with a stillness that now struck Judith as something other than composure. The hands were pressed flat against each other, the way hands press when they are preventing themselves from doing something else. Judith set down her swab and walked out of the studio and stood in the kitchen drinking water from the tap. Not because she was thirsty, but because the faucet was on the far side of the apartment from the easel, and she found she wanted the distance. The next morning, which was Friday, the father's left hand had moved. Both hands now gripped the woman's shoulders with unmistakable force. The painted knuckles were white, not aged white, not degraded white, but the deliberate, angry white of a man squeezing hard enough to feel bone. And the woman's head, which had faced forward in the proper manner of an 18th century subject, had turned perhaps 2 degrees to the right, as though she were beginning to look over her shoulder at the hands that held her. Judith photographed the painting from 4 angles. She placed the Polaroids beside the earlier image. The change was not quarter-inch ambiguity. It was visible, measurable, and had occurred during the 8 hours she had been asleep in the next room. She called the probate lawyer in Bethesda and asked whether the Kessler estate files contained any conservation history for the painting, prior cleanings, condition reports, anything that might explain unusual behavior in the paint surface. She did not say unusual behavior. She said pigment instability, which was a phrase that meant something specific and technical and would not cause the lawyer to ask the kind of questions she could not answer. The lawyer put her on hold, came back, and read from what he said was a handwritten inventory card filed with the shipping crate. Stable condition, heavy varnish, no restoration recommended. And a note. The original estate agent, in 1923, had advised that the painting remain varnished. No reason given. Judith thanked him and hung up and sat in the kitchen with both hands around a coffee cup, thinking about the word advised, which was not the same as recommended and not the same as requested and carried in its studied formality the weight of someone who had wanted to say something much stronger and had settled for the most professional language available to convey warning to people who did not believe in warnings. She did not work on the canvas that day. She locked the studio door, which she had never done before, and went to the Phillips Collection on 21st Street and stood in front of Renoir's luncheon of the boating party for a long time, studying the frozen gestures of people permanently at ease, and wondering when she had started to think of painted figures as people who might prefer to be doing something else. That afternoon, she drove to the lawyer's office in Bethesda. She told him she needed to examine the full estate files for the painting. Provenance documentation, correspondence, anything the Kessler family had kept. The lawyer, who had the incurious efficiency of a man billing by the hour, gave her access to a file box in his conference room. Most of it was customs paperwork and insurance valuations. But near the bottom she found a letter, typed on cotton bond paper and dated March 4th, 1931, from the estate agent who had originally sold the painting at the 1923 Vienna auction. It had been written in English, formal and careful, addressed to no one in particular, perhaps to any future owner. And it said this: "The painting designated Lot 31 in the Kessler estate auction is accompanied by the following conditions, which I relay on behalf of the late Herr Kessler's explicit instructions preserved in his will. The painting must not be cleaned, restored, or subjected to any process that removes material from its surface. The varnish layers are not decorative and must remain intact. The painting must be stored in darkness when not displayed, and should ideally not be displayed at all. These conditions are not negotiable. They were impressed upon me by Herr Kessler personally before his death, and his emphasis was such that I record them here as a matter of professional obligation rather than personal belief. Herr Kessler stated that the painting contains an original composition beneath a secondary application of paint, and that the secondary application was executed by the original artist as a corrective measure. He used the word Schutz, which I translate as protection. He stated that the upper layers of paint were applied to protect the viewer from the lower layers, and that any removal of the upper layers would constitute, in his words, Einbefreiung, a liberation." The letter was unsigned except for a firm stamp from the estate agency. Judith read it twice in the fluorescent light of the conference room, and filed it as precisely the sort of superstitious nonsense that a Viennese collector might generate around an unsigned canvas to increase its mystique and its value. She copied the German words into her notebook. Schutz, eine Befreiung. Because she was thorough, not because she believed them. She thanked the lawyer and drove back to Georgetown and went to bed, thinking about the father's hands and not about the letter, because the letter was a story and the hands were a fact, and she was not yet ready to consider the possibility that both were the same thing. Saturday morning. She unlocked the studio. The father's hands had moved from the woman's shoulders to her throat, not close to the throat, on it. The thumbs pressed the windpipe. The fingers wrapped the sides of the neck, and the woman's face, still mostly obscured by darkened varnish, had contorted into something that no 18th century portrait convention could accommodate. The mouth was open. The children had turned toward their mother, their hands reaching up toward the father's arms, and their small painted faces bore expressions of such exact and unembellished terror that Judith felt her own throat constrict, as if the studio air had thickened to something that required effort to draw in. She backed out of the room. She closed the door. She sat on her bed with her coat still on and her shoes still on, and did not move for what she later estimated was an hour and 20 minutes, during which time she considered and rejected the following possibilities: that she was losing her mind, that someone was entering her apartment and altering the painting as a cruel joke, that the Kessler estate had sent her a trick canvas rigged with some mechanism she couldn't detect, that the solvents she used were producing hallucinatory fumes. The last of these was the most reasonable and the one she trusted least, because the Polaroids on the corkboard did not hallucinate, and they showed what she had seen. She returned to the studio at noon to photograph the new position, and found that the painting had changed again in the 3 hours since she had left. The father's grip had tightened. The tendons in his painted wrists were visible now, rendered with an anatomical precision that surpassed anything else in the composition, as though the artist had lavished his greatest skill on the mechanics of this particular act. And the children had moved further. They were no longer reaching for their father's arms. One child, the smaller one positioned on the left, had pressed its face into the other child's shoulder. The gesture was so human, so immediately recognizable as a child hiding from something it cannot bear to watch, that Judith had to set down the Polaroid camera because her hands were shaking too badly to frame the shot. She locked the studio again. She left the apartment entirely and walked to the Georgetown branch of the public library, where she spent the afternoon in the periodicals room, with a growing stack of art history journals and auction house catalogs, searching for anything connected to the painting's provenance. The Viennese estate sale of 1923 yielded one mention, a footnote in a dealer's catalog describing the lot as family portrait, unattributed, from the Kessler collection, in deteriorated condition, notable for extensive overpainting, consistent with later amateur restoration or deliberate concealment. The word stopped her. Concealment, not restoration, not correction. Concealment, which implied the presence of something beneath the visible surface that someone had specifically chosen to hide. She searched for the Kessler name across every index available to the Georgetown Library. There was little. A brief mention in a 1919 Viennese newspaper. She could not read German, but the librarian helped her with a dictionary, describing the death of one Friedrich Kessler, collector and dealer, in the influenza epidemic. His estate had been liquidated by a nephew. A secondary mention in an art dealer's memoir from 1935 noted that Kessler had been eccentric in his acquisitions, preferring objects with unusual provenance, and known to store certain items in sealed conditions with explicit instructions against cleaning or restoration. The memoir offered no explanation for this preference. Judith wrote the sentences down in her notebook, underlining explicit instructions against cleaning or restoration twice, and walked back to the apartment in the October dark, feeling the specific chill that attaches to the discovery that someone, decades ago, tried to prevent exactly what you have done. That night, lying in bed with every light in the apartment on and the radio playing low in the kitchen, she heard the sound for the first time. It came from the studio, a wet, compressed noise. The sound of someone choking on something too thick to be air, a gurgling that rose and caught and hitched and rose again, rhythmic as breathing, but wrong in the way that a thing can be wrong when it mimics life without containing it. It lasted perhaps 30 seconds. Then it stopped, and the silence afterward was worse than the sound, because silence after a sound like that means either the choking has stopped or the person has. Judith did not go to the studio. She lay in bed with her hand on her own throat, feeling her pulse beat against her fingers, counting the beats, because counting was something her mind could do instead of imagining what was on the other side of that door. In the morning, the father had the woman's head bent backward. The children were no longer reaching for his arms. They had retreated to the far edge of the canvas, huddled together in the corner of the painted room, and their faces were turned away. Whatever was happening to their mother, they had stopped trying to prevent it. Judith stood in the studio doorway and wept, not from fear, though she was more frightened than she had ever been in her life, but from the helpless, childlike rage of witnessing an act of violence she could not interrupt. The painting was two-dimensional. It was pigment and oil and linen. It was object, not event. But the woman's throat was compressed under painted hands, and her painted mouth was open in a painted scream that Judith could hear now as a thin vibration in the studio air. as though the canvas were a membrane between this room and some other room where the thing she was looking at was actually happening, had always been happening, had never stopped. She decided to return the painting. The thought arrived with the clarity of a solution so obvious it seemed embarrassing. She would wrap the canvas, drive it to the lawyer's office in Bethesda, and tell him that the varnish removal had revealed structural damage beyond her capacity to repair. A lie, but a professional one. The kind the conservators told when a project exceeded them. The lawyer would find someone else or withdraw the piece from auction. Either way, she would be free of the painting by noon. She went to the studio to wrap it. She had acid-free tissue, cotton batting, a rigid transport case she used for deliveries. She laid the materials on the drafting table and approached the easel with the cotton batting held in front of her, which she recognized as absurd and did not care. The children in the corner had turned their faces back toward the room, and they were looking at Judith with an expression she could not read. Or could read, but refused to, because what it most resembled was hope. She reached for the stretcher bars. Her hands closed around the wooden frame, and the studio air thinned to something that was not quite air, a substance that entered her lungs but carried no satisfaction, as though the oxygen had been removed and replaced with something that occupied the same volume but served no biological purpose. She could not breathe, not in the dramatic, gasping sense of suffocation, but in the slow, meticulous way that a thing is taken from you incrementally, so that you cannot identify the exact moment of loss. Each breath a little shallower, each inhalation a little less complete, until the cumulative deficit pressed against the inside of her chest. She released the painting. The air returned. She stumbled backward, knocking the transport case to the floor, and stood in the hallway breathing in deep, deliberate pulls that she counted. 1, 2, 3, 4. The way she counted brush strokes, making each one deliberate and complete, forcing her lungs to accept what her body had, for a moment, forgotten how to take. The painting could not be moved. She tested this twice more that morning, approaching the easel from different angles, and each time the thinning began the moment her fingers touched the frame and ceased the moment she let go. The effect was systematic, reliable, reproducible, a system that operated according to rules she did not understand but could observe. Then she tried the front door. The hallway was wrong. She registered this before she could name what, specifically, had changed. The walls were too close, the ceiling too low, the perspective compressed as though the corridor were a painting of a corridor rather than the thing itself. The baseboard trim ran in straight lines toward a vanishing point that should have been the landing and the stairs, but was instead a flat terminus, a wall where no wall existed, rendered with the formal precision of 18th century architectural perspective. She took 3 steps toward it, and the air thinned again, not gradually this time, but all at once, as though she had walked into a sealed room, and the walls on either side of her seemed to lose their third dimension, flattening, the crown molding becoming a painted line, the door frame to the bathroom becoming a rectangle of muted color with no depth behind it. She retreated. The hallway restored itself, slowly in the way a cramp releases, the depth returning to the walls, the vanishing point reopening into the landing and the staircase that led to the first floor and the street and the world outside, all of which were still there, all of which were still real, but all of which were now on the other side of something she could not cross. She tried 3 more times over the course of that morning, once through the kitchen, which opened onto a narrow back garden. The garden was still visible through the window, but when she opened the door, the garden was flat, 2-dimensional. A painting of flagstones and brown grass, rendered in the exact palette of the canvas in the studio. The same ochres and muted greens, as though the painting's visual logic were spreading outward from the easel into the architecture of the apartment itself, converting every exit into a surface. The third attempt was the living room window, which she unlatched and raised 6 inches before the air outside thinned to nothing, and the view of P Street compressed into a flat image. Cars and trees and pedestrians rendered in pigment, frozen, a street scene in oils that she could see but not enter. She was inside the painting, or the painting was inside her apartment. The distinction had stopped mattering. She lowered the window and sat on the kitchen floor with her back against the refrigerator and a bread knife on the tiles beside her. Not because she thought a knife would help, but because the weight of it in her peripheral vision was a fact. A solid and explicable fact. And facts were what she needed. The choking sounds continued. They slid under the studio door and filled the apartment with their wet, compressed rhythm. And the pressure on her throat returned. Gentle but continuous. A reminder that whatever was happening on the other side of that door was also happening, in some diminished but detectable way, to her. She sat on the kitchen floor and reviewed what she knew. The painting depicted what she had taken for a family. The painting was changing. The father was strangling the mother. The children were afraid. The changes occurred at night and accelerated in proportion to the amount of varnish she had removed. The estate agent in 1923 had advised against cleaning. Kessler had stored certain items with instructions against restoration. Someone had overprinted the canvas. The dealer's catalog had used the word concealment. And the layers she was removing were not routine varnish, but something applied with purpose, for a reason that had nothing to do with preservation and everything to do with keeping the original composition sealed. She made a decision. She would stop cleaning. She would leave the remaining varnish intact. She would cease all solvent work and wait, in the hope that the painting's changes were connected to the removal of its surface layers and that stopping the removal would stop the progression. It was the only hypothesis available. She did not enter the studio for 2 days. She slept on the living room couch, as far from the painting as the apartment permitted. The choking sounds continued at night. She could hear them through the walls, the wet, rhythmic compression traveling through the plaster and the lathe, with a fidelity that seemed to increase with each passing hour, as though the sound were learning the acoustic properties of the building and adjusting itself for maximum reach. By Sunday evening, she could hear it in the kitchen. By Monday morning, she could hear it standing at the front door, which she opened and found had restored its depth. The staircase was real, the landing was real, but the air on the threshold had the flat, tasteless quality of something already breathed. And when she put one foot across the doorframe, her vision compressed at the edges, the stairway narrowing to a painted corridor, and she pulled back. The apartment let her reach the threshold, but not cross it. The apartment let her open windows, but not climb through them. The apartment had become, in the precise and functional sense of the word, a frame. She returned at dusk from a day spent entirely in the kitchen and the living room, moving between them in a circuit that was not pacing and was not calm, and stood in the hallway outside the studio. She could hear the choking, louder, continuous, and beneath it, a new sound, softer, subtler, a dry whisper that seemed to come from inside the walls themselves. It sounded like canvas moving against stretcher bars. She opened the studio door. The painting had changed. She had done no cleaning. She had not touched the canvas in 48 hours. And yet the figures had advanced beyond anything she could have predicted. The father's hands were buried to the wrist in the woman's throat, not pressing on it, but sunk into the painted flesh, as if the neck were yielding, the fingers disappearing into the column of tissue, which had distended around them in a way that no anatomy could accommodate. The woman's mouth was open wider than any human mouth. The jaw rendered at an angle that the facial structure could not support. And from the dark cavity of that painted mouth, the choking sound emerged. Not as a vibration this time, but with the presence of a voice in the room, the specific acoustic quality of sound that occupies air it shares with you. And the children had moved to the very edge of the canvas. The taller child's right hand was pressed flat against the inside of the painting's border, not painted near it, but pushed against it, the fingers splayed, the posture of a person pressing against glass. The smaller child's face was turned toward Judith. Its eyes, which she had assumed were the pale, indistinct ovals of an 18th century child, were not indistinct. They were vivid. They were specific. And they were watching her with an attention that she felt land on her skin. She backed out of the studio, and as she did, she looked at the father's face, something she had been avoiding for days, because the face of a man strangling a woman is not a face anyone wants to study. But now she looked, and what she saw stopped her in the doorway. His expression was wrong, not wrong for a murderer, wrong for the scene. The mouth was not set in rage or sadism or the blank concentration of a man performing violence. The mouth was set in something closer to anguish. The brow was creased not with anger, but with effort. The distinct effort of a man who is doing something physically excruciating because the alternative is worse. And his eyes, which she had noticed days ago were watching her rather than the woman, carried an expression that she could not reconcile with strangulation. He looked afraid. She went to the kitchen and sat at the table and opened her notebook. The German words she had copied in the Bethesda conference room 3 days ago were still in the margin, inert as the inventory they had seemed at the time. Schutz. She had filed the word as physical. Protection of the paint surface, the way a conservator uses the term. But the estate agent had not been a conservator. The estate agent had been relaying instructions from a collector who stored certain items sealed with explicit warning against cleaning, and who had used the word in a context that had nothing to do with surface chemistry. Schutz. Protection. Not of the painting. Of the viewer. The choking sound intensified. Through the walls, she could hear the wet rhythm accelerating, the intervals between hitches shortening, as though whatever was happening in the studio were approaching a crisis, a threshold after which the sound would either stop or change into something else entirely. And Judith sat at the kitchen table with her notebook and the bread knife and the cold weight of a realization that was assembling itself from every piece of evidence she had gathered, each piece clicking into place with the quiet, merciless precision of a lock engaging. The painting did not depict a scene of violence. The painting depicted a scene of containment. The father's hands were not attacking the woman. The father's hands were holding her down. The white-knuckled grip was not aggression. It was the effort of a man maintaining physical control of something that was stronger than he was and getting stronger. The woman's arched body was not a victim's recoil, but the straining of a thing trying to get free. The children pressed against the border of the canvas were not frightened children fleeing violence. They were gathered there because the border was the edge, and beyond the edge was out, and they had been pressing against it for 2 centuries because a man made of paint had been holding their mother in her chair, and they could not leave without her. Every night's progression was not the escalation of an attack. It was the progressive failure of a restraint. The father's grip was slipping. The things he held were getting free, and she, with her solvents and swabs and careful, competent campaign, had been weakening the only structure that kept them down. The choking sound was not the woman being strangled. It was the father losing his grip. Judith closed the notebook. Her hands were steady, which surprised her, because the rest of her body was not. Her legs had developed a fine tremor that she could feel in her kneecaps, and her jaw had clenched to the point where her molars ached. She stood and walked to the studio door and opened it, and looked at the painting with the understanding she now possessed. And what she saw, reinterpreted through this lens, was not a horror scene, but something worse, a last stand. A painted man holding painted things in painted chairs with painted hands that were coming apart because she had applied acetone and white spirit to the surface that gave him strength, and he was losing, and he continued to hold. She had to reseal the canvas. The thought arrived not as an idea, but as an imperative. Physical, urgent, the way the body demands food or air. She had varnish in the studio. She had brushes. She could not replicate 2 centuries of protective layering in a night, but she could apply a coat over the cleaned areas, thicken the paint film, give the father something to hold with. It would be ugly work. It would be unprofessional, sloppy, rushed, an insult to the original surface. It did not matter. Nothing she had ever done in her career mattered less than the quality of this varnish coat, and nothing had ever mattered more than getting it on. She reached for the varnish jar on the drafting table. Her fingers closed around the glass, and the air in the studio changed. It did not thin. It thickened. It acquired weight and temperature. Cold. A cold that began at the floor and rose through her shoes and into her legs and settled in her chest like a stone. And with the cold came the smell. Not linseed, not turpentine, not the aged paper and dust smell of old canvas, but something else. The smell of a room in which something had been sealed a very long time ago and had continued in the darkness to breathe. A smell that was alive in the way that fermentation is alive. Not with intention, but with process. With the slow biological fact of something that should have stopped and had not. The canvas moved. Not the painted figures. The physical canvas. The linen surface bulged outward from the stretcher bars along the bottom edge, where her cleaning had been most thorough. It flexed like a membrane, pushed from behind by something with mass and persistence. And where the varnish had been fully removed, the paint film stretched thin enough that Judith could see through it. She could see the weave of the linen. She could see the white ground layer. And she could see the dark shapes pressing up from below. Shapes that the original artist had painted on the first layer, and that the protective overpainting had covered. Shapes that were not the stiff formal figures of an 18th century portrait, but something rendered with a looseness and urgency that did not belong to any period she could identify. They pressed harder. The paint film distended in rhythmic pulses, each wider than the last, and through the thinnest sections Judith could see them. Elongated forms, proportions wrong, faces that were pale ovals but not human ovals. Features that rearranged themselves each time she blinked, as though the paint were depicting something that existed in continuous flux. Something that the original artist had captured, not as a portrait, but as a specimen. The woman was one of them. The children were more. The family Judith had been studying for 3 weeks was not a family, but a set of renderings, executed with the care of documentation rather than affection. And the only figure in the composition that had been painted as a person, with the specific anatomy of anguish in the brow and the specific biomechanics of effort in the hands and the individual details of a lace collar rendered stitch by stitch, was the father. He had been painted by someone who knew him. The rest had been painted by someone who was afraid of them. The canvas tore, a small tear, perhaps 2 inches, at the lower left corner where the paint film was thinnest. Through it, something moved, not a shape, a quality, a darkness that was wet and carried the smell of sealed rooms and extended into the studio like breath, from a mouth that had been held shut for longer than breath should hold. It pooled on the floor beneath the easel, black and glistening, and the magnification lamp flickered as though the electricity in the room had encountered something it could not flow through. The darkness spread. It did not form bodies. It did not assemble limbs or faces or anything that could be named. It spread across the studio floor the way a stain spreads through fabric, slowly, evenly, with the unhurried patience of something that knows it cannot be mopped up. And where it touched the walls lost their depth. The plaster flattened. The crown molding became a painted line. The door frame to the hallway compressed into a rectangle of muted color. The same muted color, the same ochres and degraded browns that constituted the painting's palette. The apartment had been converting itself for days, she realized. The exits she had tested, the compressed hallways and flattened gardens and two-dimensional street scenes beyond the windows, those were not the painting's defense against her leaving. They were its expansion. The painted world was growing outward from the easel, one surface at a time, converting the three-dimensional apartment into an extension of the two-dimensional space inside the frame, and the darkness pooling on the floor was the medium through which the conversion traveled. She could feel it in the air. The room was becoming flat. Not compressed, but flat, losing its z-axis the way a photograph loses it. The depth between the easel and the far wall collapsing into perspective. Her own body beginning to feel thin, as though she were being pressed between two planes of glass. The varnish jar was still in her hand. The canvas rippled. Another tear opened longer, running diagonally from the center toward the top right corner, and through it the darkness poured. Faster now, driven, the smell overwhelming, and the shapes beneath the paint pressed upward and through, not fully, not as bodies, but as presences that entered the room's air the way smoke enters a room, filling it, coloring it, making it theirs. The children's faces appeared in the surface of the darkness, pale ovals, features sliding, mouths open in configurations that did not correspond to any expression Judith could name. They were not screaming. They were not smiling. They were doing something for which human faces had no equivalent. Something that the original artist had rendered on linen because rendering was the only way to pin them down, and that Judith now saw replicated on the surface of the shadow that was swallowing her studio. The father's painted body was fracturing. She could see it on the canvas, the craquelure widening, the paint cracking along the lines of stress where his hands gripped the woman-shape's throat, his entire figure degrading as the support structure of the canvas gave way around him. The solvents she had applied had not just thinned the varnish, they had weakened the linen, they had softened the ground layer, they had undermined the physical substrate that held his image together, and now, under the pressure of the things he was trying to contain, the substrate was failing. He was breaking apart, not dissolving, splintering, fracturing, the paint surface cracking into islands that separated and drifted. The image of the man losing coherence one fragment at a time, and yet his hands held. The woman-shape's throat was painted in fragments now, the image shattered into a mosaic of color, separated by widening cracks. And through each crack, the darkness pressed. But his hands remained. The lead white of his knuckles was the brightest point on the canvas, the paint there thicker than anywhere else, applied in impasto strokes that stood above the surface like small ridges, as though the artist had known that the hands would bear the greatest stress and had built them to last. They were the last solid part of the composition. Everything else, the floor, the walls of the painted room, the children, the woman's body below the throat, had fractured into disconnected tiles of color floating in darkness. but the hands held. Judith tried to unscrew the varnish jar. Her fingers would not close around the cap. They had flattened, not numb, not paralyzed, but dimensionally reduced, her fingertips pressing against the glass with the useless friction of paper on a smooth surface. She could see her own hands, and they looked like her hands, but they had no grip because grip requires depth, requires the opposition of thumb and finger across a three-dimensional object. And her thumb was becoming a painted thumb, a rendering of a thumb, an image of a digit that contained the visual information of a hand without the functional grip. The flattening radiated from the easel. She could feel this now with the precision of someone standing too close to a fire, the way heat diminishes with distance. Her hands, which had been closest to the canvas, were worst. Her wrists were stiffening, the complex hinge of radius and ulna simplifying into the angular suggestion of a joint, as an 18th century painter would render it. But her elbows still bent. Her shoulders still had depth. Her torso, 4 feet from the easel, retained enough of its third dimension that she could feel her ribs as solid structures, her spine as a column with actual diameter. She clamped the jar between her forearm and her ribs, pressing it against the cage of bone that still occupied real space, and twisted her whole body against the cap. It gave. The glass thread released, and the cap fell to the floor, and the varnish smell hit her. Sharp, solvent bright, aggressively three-dimensional in a way that the rest of the studio air was not. A smell that belonged to the world of depth and substance and physical objects that occupied real space. She could not hold the jar. She hooked it against her inner elbow, tilted her body toward the canvas, and let gravity do what her flattened hands could not. The varnish poured onto the surface in a thick, uncontrolled stream, running across the torn areas, filling the cracks, flooding every surface her solvents had weakened. The resin hit the paint with a hiss that she felt in her teeth. The darkness recoiled. Not entirely. It did not retreat from the studio, did not flow back through the tears, but it contracted, pulling inward toward the easel, the spreading shadow shrinking at the edges. Where the varnish touched bare canvas, the linen stiffened. Where it flowed into cracks, the fractures narrowed. The children's faces, which had been manifesting in the darkness around her, flickered and dimmed as though the new layer of resin were interfering with whatever frequency allowed them to project beyond the frame. She poured more. The jar was half empty. She tilted it over the center of the canvas with her forearms, her flattened hands braced uselessly against the glass, and the varnish ran down the painted surface in thick amber rivulets that filled the cracks in his image and sealed the darkness behind them. Her fingers were regaining their depth, slowly, joint by joint, the dimension returning as the varnish spread, as though the resin were pushing the flatness back into the canvas where it belonged and restoring the room's three-dimensionality in the process. His hands, the impasto ridges of lead white, disappeared beneath the amber coat, and she felt something that she could not justify and did not try to. The sense that the varnish was not just sealing the surface, but giving him material, giving him back what she had taken. The painted man was being painted over again by a different hand, with cruder tools and none of the original artist's precision, but the function was the same. Schutz. Protection. Another layer between the things below and the world above, applied not with the measured skill of a master, but with the desperate, graceless urgency of a woman who understood, too late, what the first layer had been for. The tears in the canvas closed, not healed. The linen did not re-knit itself, but sealed. The varnish flowing into the openings and hardening there, forming amber scabs over the wound she had permitted. This was not possible. She knew this with the part of her mind that was still a conservator, still a professional, still a woman who understood the curing properties of damar resin dissolved in turpentine. Poured this thick, the varnish should have remained liquid for weeks, should have dissolved the fragile paint beneath, should have pooled and run and done nothing useful at all. But the resin was setting. She could see it stiffening under the lamp, not drying through evaporation, which was how varnish dried, but hardening from within, as though the canvas were accepting the seal the way it had accepted the original, as though the function mattered more than the chemistry, as though the painting understood what a protective layer was supposed to do and was enforcing that understanding regardless of the material's physical properties. The darkness pooling on the studio floor stopped spreading. It held its position for a long, terrible moment. The smell intense, the shadows deep, the air still flat and tasteless at the room's edges. And then it began to withdraw, slowly. Not retreating, but being pulled, drawn back toward the canvas by whatever force the new varnish had restored. The shadow thinning on the floorboards and receding toward the easel the way a tide recedes, leaving behind a residue. Not physical, not visible, but present in the air, in the smell, in the singular quality of stillness that fills a room after something has occupied it and gone. The canvas went still. Judith emptied the remainder of the varnish onto the surface. She did not care about drips or runs, or the amber pooling that would dry in uneven ridges across the composition. She coated every inch she could reach, working the resin into the weave with her bare fingers, which had regained enough depth to grip and press and feel the texture of linen beneath her skin. The studio smelled of turpentine and damar and the fading trace of something older. The darkness was gone. The walls had regained their depth. The door frame behind her was three-dimensional again, leading to a hallway that led to stairs that led to a street where real cars passed and real people walked, and the October air carried nothing more sinister than the smell of wet leaves and exhaust. She stepped back. The painting was unrecognizable as professional work. The fresh varnish had obliterated the cleaned areas under a thick, uneven coat of amber resin that turned the entire composition into a smear of muted color. The figures barely visible beneath the new layer, the father's hands invisible, the children's faces gone, the woman's distended throat sealed beneath the same kind of darkness that the original overpainting had provided. It looked terrible. It looked like a painting that had been vandalized by an amateur. It looked, in fact, like something that had been concealed. She sat on the floor of the studio with her back against the wall. Her hands were shaking. The amber varnish on her fingers was beginning to dry, tightening the skin, and she realized she had not been breathing properly for some time. Shallow, rapid breaths that had left her dizzy and slightly dissociated, as though she were watching herself from across the room. She made herself breathe deeply. She counted the breaths. She looked at the painting on the easel and tried to determine whether the stillness behind its surface was the stillness of containment or the stillness of patience. She could not tell. The varnish was fresh. It was a single coat of damar resin, applied without brush, without primer, without preparation, poured from a jar by a woman whose hands had been losing their third dimension at the time. By any law of chemistry she understood, it should still have been liquid, a thick, useless puddle dissolving the original paint beneath it. Instead, it had set. It had sealed the tears. It had done what varnish was not supposed to be capable of doing, because what it was doing was not chemistry, but repetition. The same act the original artist had performed 2 centuries ago. The application of a layer between the things below and the world above, and the painting had recognized the gesture, if not the skill behind it. But recognition was not the same as strength. This was not 2 centuries of accumulated protection. It was not the work of an artist who had understood what he was sealing and had built the seal to last. It was a patch, the equivalent of pressing one's hand over a wound and hoping. The father was in there. She could feel him, or feel his absence, which was worse, the space where his painted body should have been filled now with varnish and uncertainty. His hands, those impasto ridges of lead white, were buried under amber. She did not know if they still held. She did not know if the new varnish had given him enough material to maintain his grip, or if the solvents she had applied had already weakened him past the threshold of recovery, past the point where any amount of schutz could compensate for what she had dissolved. She did not know. She sat in the studio through the night. The building settled around her. The tick of cooling pipes, the creak of old joists adjusting to the temperature drop, the distant sound of a car on P Street. Normal sounds, the sounds of a building being a building. But she listened to each one with the focused attention of a woman waiting for a sound that did not belong, a sound that would mean the patch had failed, that the things beneath the paint had found the weakness in her crude, desperate work, and had begun to press through again. The morning came. Gray Georgetown light through the studio windows. The painting sat on the easel, dark and slick under the fresh varnish. Nothing had changed in the night. Nothing had moved. The surface was smooth and still. Judith did not leave the studio. She sat in the chair she used for detailed work, 4 feet from the canvas, and watched. She would watch for a long time. She would watch until she was certain, truly certain, not the false certainty of someone who needs to believe, but the earned certainty of someone who has observed long enough to know that the stillness was real, that the seal held, that the man inside the painting had enough paint left in his hands. She was not certain yet. The varnish was still tacky. The studio was quiet. Outside on P Street, someone passed the window. A real person in a real coat, moving through real October air on their way to a real destination. And Judith watched them go and envied them with an intensity that she would carry for the rest of her life. The weightless, ignorant ease of a person who does not know what is under the surface of things, who has never dissolved the only layer that mattered, who walks through a world built on seals they will never see and never, with their confident and competent and well-intentioned hands, think to break. The building settled. A pipe ticked. Somewhere in the walls, something shifted. Or the walls shifted, or nothing shifted at all, and the sound was simply what old buildings do in the morning when the heat comes on and the wood expands and the plaster adjusts itself to the new day's temperature. Judith listened. The varnish dried slowly in the cold room. The building ticked and creaked and settled, and beneath it, so faint she might have invented it, so quiet it might have been nothing more than the sound of her own breath catching in a throat still raw from hours of shallow, panicked respiration. She heard it. A single at hitch. The compressed, gurgling catch of something choking on something too thick to be air, lasting less than a second. Coming from the direction of the canvas and then gone, absorbed into the ordinary sounds of the building, before she could be certain it had been there at all.